45,000 Americans die by suicide every single year. That figure is double the number who die by homicide. And when you include deaths of despair from drug and alcohol abuse, that number soars to 150,000 a year. We're bombarded by endless media coverage and campaigning on the necessity of gun control to save lives. Yet we never see anywhere near the same amount of attention or alarm when it comes to America's suicide epidemic. Why is that? Could it be because the primary victims of this suicide epidemic are middle-aged, working-class, white men? Could it be that our entire economic system and culture is now set up to be so hostile to this demographic that it's both causing their suicides and then ensuring that any real discussion around understanding or preventing those suicides doesn't take place? Over the last 10 years, the overall suicide rate in the US has increased 30%. White men, who represent 30% of the population, account for 70% of suicides. Looking at suicides by race in America, there's one demographic that sticks out like a sore thumb. Deaths of despair now kill more Americans than those who died during the Vietnam War or at the height of the crack epidemic. The mortality rate for whites with no more than a high school degree is about 30% higher than for blacks, having been 30% lower as recently as 1999. The phenomenon is also going transatlantic, as deaths of despair among middle-aged British men have also begun to rapidly climb. The media and the culture tells us to talk about our feelings, to talk about our depression, to the point of relentless gushing emotional incontinence. But talking about it hasn't achieved anything. There's no stigma around depression. Everyone talks about how depressed they are all the time, and yet depression and suicide rates continue to rise. If you don't address the underlying structural factors that are driving white working class male suicide, talking about your feelings is utterly pointless. Talking is not enough. So what are those factors? Wage stagnation, which directly leads to marriage breakdown.
In 2015, a study by the decidedly non-conservative Brookings Institution found that falling male wages caused about a quarter of the decline in marriage rates over the past 35 years. 2 years later, MIT researchers found that when factories close, marriage rates go down and single parenthood becomes more common.
Thanks to deindustrialization and globalism, rural areas are emptying out as everyone floods to the big cities. Working class Americans whose very identity, existential foothold, and economic security rested on blue-collar jobs are being left behind.
It's getting harder to make the money to provide for your family.
What does it mean as a man if you're not able to provide for that family?
It just feels like I failed. I failed my wife, I failed my kid.
There's a level of terror among people as they work longer and they fall farther and farther and farther behind.
This sense of isolation, of abandonment, which is often combined with family breakups, leaves these men with no other option than to turn to drugs in the form of opioids and alcohol.
Slightly more than 500,000 Americans live in Montgomery County, Ohio, a place most famous for being home to the Wright brothers, inventors of modern flight. But it was there, earlier this year, that the coroner's office was forced to lease space at a nearby funeral parlor. It didn't have room for the growing number of corpses killed by opioids. 160 miles away in Huntington, West Virginia, a much smaller town, 28 overdose patients arrived at local hospitals in just 4 hours. Those are just two examples of what constitute the worst drug epidemic in American history. In 2015, opioids accounted for nearly 2/3 of the 52,000 Americans killed by drug overdoses. Every day, they take the lives of 91 more Americans. That's about twice the number of Americans killed per day at the height of the war in Vietnam.
This same emptying out of flyover country also leads to the erosion of community structures. Churches, unions, social clubs, the pillars of society that middle-aged white men could once rely on, all disintegrating as fast as the manual labour market. The impact of this is also being felt in Europe, where one French farmer commits suicide every 2 days. Globalism and deindustrialization served to hollow out the economic base that supported white working-class Americans, while the wider culture itself sought to kick them while they were down, lecturing them about their privilege and the original sin of being born white.
It makes us white middle-aged males feel inadequate and we're a burden on people and we're not producing, and the more highlighted it is that I'm a have-not, the more I want to end my life.
For the past 3 years, the media has demonized white, middle-aged, working-class Americans as racists and bigots for voting for Trump.
A basket of deplorables. Racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic.
That's not why they voted for Trump. They voted for Trump because their jobs were disappearing, their communities were being eviscerated, and their lives were becoming meaningless exercises in atomized misery. How did the left react when the CDC began highlighting deaths of despair amongst white men? They laughed and celebrated.
Sorry, not sorry. These people are not worthy of any sympathy. Bunch of deplorables. And if they die quicker than the rest of us, that just means the country will be better off in the long run. It's the welcome news of hope that without that demographic dwindling and eventually gone, our chances of another Trump are significantly less. Is it bad news or good news? Middle-aged, undereducated white Americans are Donald Trump's base.
The New York Times dismissing whiteness as a suicide cult, cheering for families to be torn apart by despair and suicide because orange man bad. So tolerant, so progressive. But middle-aged white men killing themselves in droves is apparently not enough. To add insult to injury, any one of them who dared raise a whimper of dissent about their hopeless plight was met with a new volley of dismissive scorn.
Okay, boomer.
Yes, the media appropriated and then weaponized an entire meme simply to further torment a demographic of people who are already blamed for all society's ills.
You have to understand that when you say okay boomer, it really hurt.
See, the left and the media will tell you that male suicide rates are so chronic because of toxic masculinity and the stigma against talking about your feelings. Yet when any of them actually do try to talk about their feelings, when any of them try to draw attention to the underlying issues driving the suicide epidemic, they're otherized, dismissed, abused, and told to shut up.
Okay, boomer.
Why do you think middle-aged white working class men are topping themselves in record numbers? Could it be anything to do with you holding them responsible for every historical and contemporary evil under the sun, stealing their economic future and then laughing in their face? Do you think that had anything to do with it? But it's not just middle-aged white men committing suicide in staggering numbers, because when it comes to the Zoomers, the kid's on alright. The suicide rate among US children and young adults aged 10 to 24 has increased by 56% over the last 10 years. From 2007 to 2017, among youth aged 10 to 14, the suicide rate tripled. In 2017, the suicide rate among those in the same youth demographic was the second leading cause of death. Among millennials, there's been a 47% increase in major depression since 2013. Meanwhile, in the UK, suicide rates are at their highest in 17 years, while suicides of females aged 10 to 24 are at an all-time high. The pharmaceutical industry claims that much of this is due to black box warnings being placed on antidepressants after 2015. But the surge in suicides amongst young people started many years before that and coincided with the rise of the iPhone and social media after 2007. National Alliance of Mental Illness Medical Director Ken Duckworth MD told the Daily Caller, "I think we're really going to reflect on this time and think, what were we thinking?" When a child between the ages of 6 and 16 has a computer powerful enough to run a small country, they can end up with serious issues. We're seeing an association with anxiety and depression with social media use. He points out that social media like Snapchat and Instagram is causing loneliness and depression because young people feel inadequate. They see their friends having fun at parties to which they're not invited. They think their friends are living these amazingly varied, rich social lives, when in reality what they're seeing is just a carefully curated, artificially amplified highlights reel. The fact that social media messaging was literally designed to be addictive, like you're in a casino, means that young people are checking their messages sometimes hundreds of times a day. Have you ever just turned off your phone or ignored your messaging apps for a whole day and noticed how much better you feel.
22 Adelphi University students made it a whole week without their cell phones. It was part of a college course intended to break a powerful addiction.
It's just a lot more like stress-free environment. No worries about social media.
I think it's really like refreshing and like relaxing. So I was able to fall asleep like a lot easier. Doing homework was 100% easier.
I was just more appreciative of everything around me.
Social media and messaging doesn't provide your brain with the same cerebral sustenance that real-life interactions do. I think in 10 years or so, when the long-term studies are out, we're going to be absolutely horrified by the effect that social media and messaging had on depression and suicide rates amongst young people. Suicide is obviously a massive overreaction to isolation, but young people make rash decisions because their brains aren't fully formed until the age of 25. According to Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Senior Press Advisor Christopher Garrett, the fact that the brain is still developing decreases the abilities to problem-solve solutions to such painful situations or to perceive a future beyond the pain. With 47,000 Americans dying of opioid abuse every single year, this also has the knock-on impact of causing deep trauma amongst children after they lose their parents. According to Dr. Diane McIntosh, if you have trauma in your childhood, and one of the most traumatic events is losing a parent, along with physical and sexual abuse, there is no doubt that is going to have an impact on childhood development and increase the risk of depression substantially. The mass media's constant drive to destigmatize depression and suicide may actually be exacerbating the suicide epidemic. Suicide experts say Netflix's 13 Reasons Why, a show about the aftermath of a young girl's suicide, actually served to glamorize and romanticize suicide. According to Ken Duckworth MD, 13 Reasons Why violated numerous media guidelines on how they're supposed to discuss and portray suicide. The key is to not glamorize, not reveal, or post the person's suicide note, which is essentially the plot of 13 Reasons Why. According to Christopher Garrett, the entertainment media's depiction of suicide have been shown to have an influence in suicide and suicide attempts, particularly when such depictions include graphic portrayals of suicide attempts that model lethal methods. Garrett cited studies that show 13 Reasons Why caused, quote, an increase in suicidal behavior. And according to Ken Duckworth MD, there has been some research that showed people who watched it were more likely to be interested in harming themselves. So again, talking about suicide, showcasing suicide without addressing the primary driving factors may actually be causing more suicides. Some hope and some despair. Zoomers also labour under the same crushing financial burden as working class middle-aged whites. They leave college 30 grand in debt and unable to afford a home. They're forced to desperately compete with skilled immigrants for jobs that provide anywhere near decent pay. The most they can aspire to is somehow managing to scrape enough money together to rent out a pod and eat bugs.
When I was really hard up, I used to fantasize about stealing a car and getting a shotgun and driving to my hometown and murdering my parents and then dying in suicide by cop. We call that the millennial dream.
The one common factor in both middle-aged white suicides and Zoomer suicides appears to be a lack of transcendent life purpose. Boomers are told that they're racist relics who should have no stake in society, while Zoomers are deluged with a vapid sewer pipe trash culture that teaches them there is no purpose other than the pursuit of money, hedonism, and spiritual bankruptcy. A poll in the UK found that a jaw-dropping 89% of young people aged 18 to 29 feel their lives are meaningless and without purpose. Why is that? Because they're wading in a swamp of anguish and despair, imposed by a culture unfit for human habitation. A culture that never seeks to uplift, to enrich the senses, to fire the mind, but always to drag you down into the insipid bowels of degeneracy. When your heroes are just an endless avalanche of recycled comic book remake characters, when your role models are a perpetual parade of twerking imbeciles, when your icons are a monotonous march of inauthentic NPC drones with everything to risk but nothing to say, who wouldn't want to kill themselves? It's absolutely crucial for you to help me fight the war on free speech by supporting me via Subscribestar, link in description, and also signing up for my free newsletter at summit.news/newsletter.